Kia ora koutou, good morning. Welcome to the annual plan workshop, and we'd just like to start with a little bit of health and safety. In terms of health and safety, if the alarm sounds, please make your way to the nearest emergency exit. The assembly point is out on 3rd Avenue across the road from the building. Please be aware that this meeting is being live streamed and the video will be publicly available on YouTube. Members, could you please remember to speak clearly into your microphones, and please turn on your microphones because we need it for the live streaming. And please turn your phones on silent or off. Thank you very much. I'd just like to ask Steve, put him on the spot, if he could give us a karakia to open the meeting, please.
Thank you, mea mahi. He honore, he kororia ki te atua, tēnā koe papa mō te hui o tēnei wā. Ameni.
I'd just like to ask for any apologies. We've got apologies from Councillor Schooler and Councillor Schuler. Is there any? And lateness for Councillor Baker, and obviously Makari, who's still on a leave of absence. Happy to move. Any seconder? Thank you, Councillor Taylor. All those in favour? Those against? That is carried. I guess we'd just like to start off. So this is an opportunity, I guess, for us to talk about the annual plan and user fees. I think this is a pretty exciting opportunity, I believe, for our council to start setting the view of where we want to go, and I just acknowledge that this is quite a change from where we've been. We as a council are very determined to get good value for the ratepayers, to make sure that everything stacks up, that what we're doing is best for them, and there'll be some decisions there that we need to make sure that we get every dollar goes as far as it possibly can, and when we deliver things, they make sense because they do offer that value for money. And I just want to thank the staff for understanding. It is quite a big change, and I really want to thank them for the work that they've done, and being able to go through this with us, and I think this is, as I said before, it's an exciting opportunity where we start to have an opportunity to set our direction. Obviously, just wanted to reiterate that we can't keep hitting the ratepayer for everything, and that is something that I think we're agreed on around the table, that we have to find ways to do things better and different, and at a better cost, and that will go in to some of this discussion today around user fees. And I know this has been something that has been controversial in the past, but the way that I see it, it's not user pays, it's user contributions, and what you're paying and contributing to the services that you use will come off the rates bill. So you'll be paying less for that service from your rates, and more for that service those that use it. And that is a key a key differential, because I think that as a council and community, we have to provide community facilities, but ultimately we still believe that those that use those facilities, it's reasonable that they contribute something towards that. There is going to be some facilities that it's just doesn't make sense to charge for because it's too hard, or it's a community facility that that is worth delivering for nothing. But we want to be as equal and equitable across the board as we can. So that's just a differential, and we as a council will make sure that you understand what impact that has on your rates. So that's just something quite important. So look forward to getting on with it, and I'll hand over I guess to Christine to start us off. Thank you.
Just a few introduction slides from me, and then Paul's doing the bulk of the heavy lifting today. So we're just going to do a quick overview at the front end just to put the annual plan in context in terms of timing and how this work fits in, and then provide you some context around the revenue process, how user fees are set, what the legislative requirements are, so you sort of know the framework that you're operating with, and we'll just work through a couple of practical examples and then also have a conversation about rates. But I think the primary thing is it is a workshop. As you know, you can't make decisions in workshops, but you can certainly, what we're looking for is some guidance. So because user fees is such a broad topic and the nature of activities that council does is so broad, we're really looking to understand where are the areas that you want to look at and do some work on, and where are some areas that you might go, well, no, that's not something we want to focus on. Because once we have that guidance, then we can go away and do some more detailed work and bring you back some information for actual decision making through council meetings. So that's really, key purposes, provide you some information so you can understand the topic, and then for you to give us that guidance around what would you like to see back, which areas do you want to focus on, what might you see as the key considerations that you want staff to take into account in the work that we do and bring back for you, so that when we do bring you back some information for decision making, it targets the areas that you want, and that we don't have big gaps compared to what you're looking for. So that's really, so a lot of this is more once we've done the sort of overview, it's really more a conversation for you to have amongst yourselves and to give us some guidance. So the next slide just talks about the planning cycle. So the green box is a long-term plan, so that's every year you do it, every 3 years you do a long-term plan, and that's for 10, and so year 1 of the long-term plan, then you do an annual report. In year 2 of the long-term plan, you do an annual report, so that's where we are currently, we're in year 2, annual plan. You report against that in that annual report year. In year 3 of the long-term plan, you do another annual plan and another annual report, and you're back to a long-term plan. You don't have to consult on annual plans if you don't want to, but I think we've heard a really clear steer from you that engagement with the community is something that you do really want to focus on, so we're taking the presumption that your guidance is at this point that you would want to consult through this annual plan process. So just rocking on through, there's one more slide. So in terms of how the timeframes work, so you've given us, we've had some initial discussion around the annual plan and the parameters that we're working through, particularly with some of the changes in terms of NZTA, but also the decision that you made around IFF and what does all of that mean. So this next period is really where you set the direction, so where you give us clear steer on what's important to you, what do you want included, what don't you want included, and how do you want to balance everything out. So we then take that guidance and we turn it into numbers, information. We create the what the contextual story is that you're painting for your community, how you want to engage with the community. Some of that starts to come out. That all gets pulled together sort of mid-December through to March. And then you would be adopting a draft annual plan for consultation. You would pull together effectively a consultation summary document. That goes out under the legislation. It needs 4 weeks for consultation. Then you have hearings. Their staff prepare detailed reports on matters that are raised through the submissions. And then you have a deliberations where you make decisions on each of the key points. And overall, so say if you decided you were going to do, the boat ramp's a good example, so that was a boat ramp was done last time, consult on it, you get feedback from the community, you'll get an issues and options paper, we summarise the views of the community, both for and against, you make a decision as to whether you wish to proceed and at what level of fee you want to proceed. That gets incorporated into the financials, it gets incorporated into the user fee schedule, comes back to you for formal adoption. you have to adopt it by the end of June, so it'll be June 2025, and that then becomes the approved budget from 1 July 2025 through to 2026. So that's just sort of how the timeframes work, so you can see where we're fitting. So any questions on that? Otherwise, I'm handing over to Paul to drill down to the detail.
Other thing I'd just say up front is that the slide pack that we loaded up into Stella is, you'll see, is a bit different to the slide deck we're going through. We've just, there's a lot of extra information in there in terms of detail for your reading pleasure, but we won't go through all of that unless you want to delve into something at a little bit more detail today. So, and again, the first half a dozen slides that I'll go through are very much, I think you've probably seen some of it before, but really just to set the scene effectively, and then move into the actual more detailed process of setting user fees. We'll talk through the funding needs analysis, the revenue and financing policy, which are the two fundamental, or the revenue and financing policy is the fundamental document that outlines how we fund and finance all of our activities. So I'll just quickly go through these first slides, and if anyone wants to please just yell out. So operational sources of funding include rates, user fees and subsidies and grants. Next slide will just show you through the actual balance of that, and in terms of capital, obviously borrowing, DCs effectively, so development contributions will repay that, but they are a form of borrowing on balance sheet in the first instance. So where does our money come from? You see just over 50% or just over half is coming from the general rate. Targeted rate is next, and then water by metre. And what I would say about targeted rates is there are two fundamental methodologies of setting targeted rates. Some is about an additional level of service for a specific area of population, and we do have a small number of those. For example, in the lakes, there is a small targeted rate which exists around increased level of service around street gardens and lighting and things. But we also set targeted rates around specific activities as well. So, for example, a resilience rate or something like that. Now, the big difference between the general rate and the targeted rate when we set it is that if you set something as a general rate, you have some flexibility in terms of how you use that to fund your activities. If you set for targeted rates, you limit the flexibility. So if a targeted rate is set for transport, that money collected on that rate can only be used for transport. So when we look at our rating surpluses deficits over a year, we calculate them at a general rate level and a targeted rate level, and you can't use targeted rates effectively back into other activities. Next slide. So just some trends. We've seen a trend towards more funding coming out of rates in recent years. I'll show you that slide in a moment, but some of that has been, there has been conversations through the last long-term plan to increase user fees, and it probably shows the difficulty in actually increasing user fees as the final decisions actually did reflect the community feedback, and more money was sitting on rates than has been in the past. That covers the next point. There has been a trend towards more targeted rates, particularly around ring fencing around specific activities. So that's been a trend of probably the last 5 years. We've seen more targeted rates set in that space, and user charges can provide contributions for users outside of the Tauranga rating area, and again, that's something we'd seek feedback on in terms of differential pricing, and because that is, whilst obviously every user of a facility, whether they live inside the boundary or not, will pay the user fee, there is also the opportunity for differential charging effectively for residents of the city versus non-residents of the city. Next, thank you. So just in terms of that trend, you can see the blue line is showing what rates have done in the last 10 or so years. The orangey line is user fees, and then the bottom line is water by metre. So that's historically, that's that comment around, we have seen more of a push towards rates rather than user fees in recent years. Where most of our user fees come from, the big three are airport, parking and building. You can see airport is effectively sourced from two main sources. One is from our commercial property rental. The other is from, in particular, Air New Zealand through landing charges, also other passenger aircraft, or other aircraft, but the bulk of it is through user fees. And again, that has increased. If we went back in time, you would see a huge increase in the portion of airport fees through that model of payment for air services, effectively, as opposed to just traditional commercial property services there. Parking, not quite yet, thanks. So parking being the orange, continual growth in that area. It is a fundamental part of the conversation around as using the ability to have parking as a funding source for financing of Te Manuataki. So that's part of the increased parking revenue going forward in that perspective, and then building is the other big slice of fees we've got there. Okay, so I'll just pause there if there's any. That's just a very, very, very quick overview of the general before we get into the more detail around how we set the fees. Any questions so far?
Sorry, Paul, just wanting that last slide there. Is it possible to get historic, say back 10 years on that? That'd be great.
Yeah, Paul, I was just interested, like, for example, airport. Are we sort of judging ourselves against other airports, like Hamilton, for example, around, you know, the fees that we charge and, you know, the leases, etc.?
Yeah, certainly from an aircraft charging perspective, we do, and that's been a big push in the last 3 or 4 years to actually lift us up, to get us very comparable with other similar. So that's the first revenue source. So the answer is yes, and we're comparable. The second is in terms of car parking. That's the other significant revenue source that comes off. And again, we do and have lifted that in the last 4 or 5 years as well, to be comparable with other similar size cities. In terms of property, it tends to be a little bit more specific in terms of, like, not all airports have the same property portfolio, but we do look at market rates in terms of you know, the rental income coming off property. There was some reduction through the COVID period, obviously in terms of aircraft volumes. There was revenue loss. There was also, you know, Ray worked pretty closely with tenants to actually maintain those tenancies through COVID. So there was a drop in the level of increase through that period, which is now working through catch up. So that's about just, you know, keeping a balance of vacancy rates low with the amount of revenue we can pull off them.
One more question: what sort of things make up other? Like, that's quite a big.
It's mainly that commercial rental revenue property.
So just moving through. So I'll step through these in a little bit more detail. So funding needs analysis, revenue and funding policy, and then moving into the user fees and rating decisions. So you jump straight to, so Jeremy did take a report, I think the 16th of September meeting, which went through the user fees setting, which again, if you wanted to see any of the key documents in that there were links in terms of all of that. Okay, so funding needs analysis. It's a requirement under Section 1013 of the Local Government Act, and really what it's doing is, for each activity, considering what are the community outcomes, who benefits, actions or inactions that need to do for the activity, and then the costs and benefits of funding that activity separate from other activities. So really what it's saying is, if we, and I'll go through an example for animal services to actually show how it works in more detail, but we're really looking at, does it provide public or private benefit, and that is sort of the triggers effectively of how we then decide where to set our revenue financing policy percentages, which then flow through to the user fees conversation. So the first step effectively in setting any user fee is to do this funding needs analysis and determine that public and private good element is the first part of the process that sits there. Okay. Step 2, revenue and financing policy. So from the funding needs analysis, we take that into the revenue and financing policy. That was included in Stellar in terms of the latest version of what we have with that. That effectively is for each of our key activities. It effectively goes through a choice of what are all the particular funding sources relevant to that activity, considering the public and private benefit that exists from it, and then decisions can be made by council in terms of how do they want to actually set that policy. That policy then is consulted on as part of an LTP in normal circumstances. So we've been quite look to try and create some flexibility in ours. So you'll see if you've looked at the document itself, it has ranges of percentages of funding allocations. So, for example, it may say that you can set user fees between 10 and 30% of the cost of the activity. That's a movement away of where we've been in the past, where we were sort of up to 10%. So it's trying to provide flexibility so that you don't need to necessarily go back and redo your revenue and financing policy each time you want to change a user fee. You would only need to do that if you're going way outside of those bounds, for example. So if it said 10 to 30%, you wanted to go back and reset a fee at 40%, you would need to go back through the whole process of funding needs analysis, revenue and financing policy, and then set the user fee. But you do have some flexibility by the way we've created this policy to actually work within those boundaries. Make sense? And then the third step is effectively the user fees and charges the decisions. Just point out that there are really there's the fees that are required to be set by legislation. So, for example, fees under the Building Act, they are required to go through a consultation process. But other fees, there is more flexibility in how you can set them, and you'll see in parking, for example, we've had annotations on our that it can be reset throughout the year, and that that's not set under any specific legislation, just part of the user fees regime, which we normally and traditionally consult on as part of an annual plan or long-term plan process. So I can't remember an example where we haven't gone out through an annual plan to consult on user fees. So that's normally what we would do, would be any proposal goes out for consultation as part of an annual plan. So I'm just going to pause there for a second. We can go through a more detailed example. I might get Catherine to take us through so you don't have to listen to me all the time. If there's no questions before we...
Sorry, just a quick one. Do we actually put the rationale for how we calculate the fees out to the public when we consult?
Normally what we would do as part of the consultation, if it was a significant change, we would look to include some commentary. If it's things like it's going up by CPI, no. Except to say that generally in the past we've had the view that we would keep user fees tracking at CPI. It's not always possible, just because some of the fees are pretty small in denomination, so it doesn't always work. But if it was something significant, like sports fields was the one that we did last year, there was commentary around the rationale.
I just think from a transparency point of view, it'd be really good if we could, like, we're going to obviously go through some parameters on how we decide these things.
Yep. If
that was disclosed to the public, it would probably ease their mind on how we actually got to the figure. We didn't just pick it out of the air, sort of things.
Yep, sure. And part of that is that this information is available as part. I know it's a little bit, it feels a little bit legislative in some ways, but to bring some of the information out of here, as we work through this, you'll see that it does look to explain the rationale as to why we would put it onto rates or why we would put it onto user fees as well. So things can be extracted out of these documents to assist with that.
Okay, so I'll just take you through briefly. So basically what Paul was saying, you'll see in each of these slides actually happening. So the first step was in this funding needs analysis, thinking about what benefits come from this activity, who does benefit, and or creates a need for the activity. So with animal services, obviously you've got animal control, people feel safe, and there's elements of dog registration enables dog owners to be have legal ownership and enables tracing of impounded dogs. So there's a big private benefit, but there is also a public benefit to managing animals in our community. So the primary outcome benefits then become we protect our environment, keep it safe, and these relate to those primary community outcomes that are developed through the long-term planning process, and it sort of feels like an inclusive, comfortable city to be in. The beneficiaries are, of course, owners of dogs and other animals, and see schools and workplaces receiving education. So there's some parts of that activity that are benefiting that sector, and then the community as a whole benefiting from managing animals well in the community. And the benefit, it's sort of an operational benefit, if you like. It's going to rise in the year the funding is sourced. And who creates a need? People who would like to have dogs in the community. So we looked at the funding, and council considers this funding, and has done so on several occasions with respect to animals, and said, okay, it is primarily for the benefit of dog owners, so or they're the main sort of cause of it, so they should pay most of it. So we'll have some fees, and then there's a general rates benefit, a general rates funding for a portion to represent benefit to the wider community. So that sort of flows through. That is a public, we make that document public as part of this great long-term plan, and those ideas could easily come through into why you're being asked to pay this amount of money. And so again, this part of that funding needs analysis that sits in there flows that through to the potential funding sources. So we talked about, you know, general targeted rates, you can have user fees and charges. Sometimes there are grants and subsidies that can come in. And then the rationale, which starts to really step through the kind of stuff you put out into the community, saying this is why we're charging some of this on general rate, but most of it's a dog registration charge. And then the second document, which is consulted on, is the revenue and financing policy, and it gets summarised down just to those, from our range of options of funding, these are the ones we're going to use, and we have a banded process, so we can say you can expect mainly user charges will fund this activity, and so when that it's a high sort of share of the funding, we've made a 70 to 100% band, and we've said between 0 and 30% will be funded from general rates or grants and subsidies. So in terms of if you want to change things, if you work within those bands, then that's fine. If you're wanting to move outside those bands, then there's probably a review of there will be a review of that revenue and financing policy, of the analysis and consultation. So these are just some of the examples of the way user fees are set, and the nature of the user fees for animal services, and then it's translated through to our financials in terms of rates fundings coming in at 442,000, 20%. Fees and charges are 1.6 million. So that's sort of how it all ties in together. Any questions on that?
So we went through that breakneck speed just because we really want to get into the feedback from you in terms of how you want to actually look at the user fees in terms of the annual plan. Sorry, Councillor Kira.
Councillor Correct, yeah.
It's not a question, but perhaps if we can continue, I've got more of a sharing my views in terms of our approach to the user fees versus rates, etc. So I'll just leave it for now.
Councillor Taylor.
Sorry, on that example there, why do we have some of it go on to general rates? Because it seems very specific that if you own a dog, you should pay this.
Don't get registered, and there is a public interest in being able to track those dogs, deal with challenges. So that's all covered by the animal services activity. They have other roles rather than just enabling a legal entitlement and impounding them when they stray. Sometimes they impound them when they stray and they're not registered. So why would the complying dog owners pay for that?
Go back to that the funding needs analysis. What it's saying is that the public good is actually the protection of dangerous dogs for the general public. That's why there's a rates element in there for that public good. Correct.
Councillor Morris.
Thank you. And I remember a few years ago it was zero, but the strong argument by responsible dog owners was why were they paying for the irresponsible owners who weren't registered and were causing a significant number of issues. So I think in terms of information coming back on this specific example, I think it would be good to know the number of call-outs or the amount of time and attention that's given to unregistered dogs, because that would provide insight into the public good element to it. But I'd also make the observation about Auckland Council, which has the responsible dog owner discount. There's an interesting way of framing it as a discount. I wonder whether they just have an extra charge on those that have had enforcement action taken upon them, and that the discount is really just the baseline. But do we offer anything like that in Tauranga? My feeling is that we don't.
Sarah would obviously be able to provide more detail, but as a general response, there's two approaches. You can take the approach that all dog owners are good, and if something goes wrong, you fine them because there's a list of infringements you can give them, or you can go through a very administrative heavy process of people who haven't had an infringement for a period of time and meet a criteria, and that criteria is around fencing, the way you look after your dog, so that becomes very administratively heavy. So a lot of, I wasn't involved in the debate, but a lot of councils take the approach that dogs are good, dog owners are good, and if they're not, they get an infringement. So it's just an option, another way of looking at it.
Councillor Currack, sorry. Oh, Councillor Morris, yeah.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Rick, I apologise for butting in.
Enjoy your...
You enjoy it, thank you. So do I.
Your own input.
Yeah. Thank you for that context, Barbara. I appreciate that. I think that's a good way of looking at it. Do the fines recover the cost of enforcing or taking enforcement action? Because I'm wondering, 'cause those are prescribed, aren't they, under an act? So we can't say your fine is now Z when the act says Y.
I'm a little bit too far away from it now, but you're right that the fines are legislative fines. Some of them are quite significant, but most of them are, I think, from memory around that 150 to 2. But we could get that information for you because I'm a bit out of date, so it might need to be updated.
So, welcome, Councillor Baker. So just in response to Steve's question around discounts, a friend of mine is a dog owner, and to me she's a perfect dog owner. I just give her credit in that. Her dog, for whatever reason, went astray and picked up by Animal Services. She went there to pick the dog up, and she was told, look, I see you're a good dog owner, and here's your dog, and everything is sweet. I'll tell you, she really appreciated that. Having a council that uses a bit of discretion and rewards a good dog owner, it went a long way in terms of her view of council. So, a lot of ratepayers and residents don't have much interaction with council. So that's the feedback, and I commend Animal Services around that approach. But when we look at the wider user fees versus rates, we've got to take into account community health and well-being. And this is a good example. Dogs to people and families provide a huge benefit in terms of well-being. And I think when we take into account the private versus public good, the public good is having a happy and healthier community, and that needs to be, and I'm sure it is, factored into a lot of recreational activities as well. When we talk about recreational reading or recreational sports, sports in particular for the community well-being is huge, and that's why we invest a great deal into those facilities. So this whole conversation we're going to have is fraught with disparities that exist, probably for good reason, but and I think this council needs to have a good think about whether we actually want to do it and go there. I know we brought up the boat ramp fee. The issue is largely around disparity, but that exists, as I said, around a lot of activities. The sports users were hit with increases into, like one example is tennis. I got an email from a guy who had a real issue around removing the boat ramp charge because he said, well, his fee was ramped up a great deal, and they get a huge benefit in terms of health and well-being from that activity. And so you can understand that, yeah, this whole issue is fraught with that, with those disparities. And why am I paying this? And the more people are starting to pay in rates, and we saw your graph, Paul, ramping up the rates. And the timing of that was interesting. It's from, I think, 2021, it started to ramp up. You know, it's a time where we're entering into an easy money environment. You know, the Reserve Bank plunged interest rates there. You know, you're just driving down, I remember driving down Hewletts Road and thinking, wow, everything seems so ramped up in terms of the economy. And that was done for a reason, obviously, to spare a big recession. But now, you know, we're entering that party's over and we're entering into a hangover stage. And so we need to address that. And that's not in terms of additional taxes via new user fees. I think we need to focus more on the organisation and perhaps look at some efficiencies there. So no new taxes, but just look at our spending. And you know, I'm saying to my fellow members, we need to, thank you Steve is shaking my hand, take the central government approach and really look at where the dollars are being spent rather than wanting more dollars from our community. Because, you know, the party's over and we need to look at our spending using that affordability lens. That's my little speech.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Couric. Yeah, I guess the way I see it is it's not raising revenue, it's actually changing where the revenue comes from. So effectively, an increase in user fees would actually reduce the income required from rates. So you'd see a direct correlation there, and it's just spreading that to where the people use. Yes, I agree with you around, you know, we've got to look at where every dollar's spent, not just the capital costs. So you know, we have sort of spoken before around, you know, we're in a financially challenged situation, and everything is on the table to make sure we're living within our means, and you know, making sure that our rates do stay affordable, and I guess that's why I think it's worth looking at things like this, that this is a way that you actually you know, can help change that balance. And you know, at the moment, without a user fee, anyone that is not a resident or a ratepayer actually doesn't contribute anything to the services that they use in our city. And user fees is a mechanism that we're a very popular place to come for holiday, and some of those things people from out of town can contribute to that, which then takes some of that burden off the ratepayer. But you know, we have sort of spoken already around, you know, that rate ceiling, and that's very much what I see the long-term plan. It's not a starting point. The increases in that are the ceiling, and we're not going above those. And hopefully, if we can find other revenue sources like that, we might actually come below them. But the financially challenged situation we're in, you know, I'm not prepared to reduce rates like outside of what is planned. If that means that we're actually going to make an operating surplus and we're going to borrow, you know, to effectively fund our everyday living. So that is very much, I think, a priority that we've got to get that back to at least a break-even point as quickly as we possibly can, and that's talking to what you've said, Rick, around around making sure we've got we're looking at every line item to make sure it makes sense, so we can get back to that at least break even point, and then then we can actually start looking at potentially bringing some of those increases down a bit from what is planned.
Add to that, I think what I said before around going through the user fee process is that there'll be a lot of energy and public response to that, and I think largely to the looking at the potential benefit to rates. You're still taking additional money from our community, so it's a bit of a shift, but at the end of the day it's still a tax in a way. So I'd prefer not to go through that distraction through this annual plan process and focus more on a bit of a readjust or reset of our spending, including the general operational expenditure, and perhaps next annual plan do a bit of a discussion with our community, potentially, depending on where we get to in terms of an overall look at the operational budgets, and then look at perhaps redistribution, because that's what we're talking about. Where do we get the money from? Either rates or user fees. But the problem is, and I mentioned before, when those rates are set quite high, people will resist user fee increases because they say, well, I'm paying so much in my rates anyway, and you want more from me for using these little bits, and people don't like it. That's a challenge.
Councillor Morris.
Thank you. And I don't want to say it because it sounds really sanctimonious, but post-COVID in the private sector, there were not opportunities to increase revenue. It had to come from expenses within relative organisations. But hey, I mean, we all know that, and we all know the public sector is different to the private sector, and providing a service and serving the community, etc. It's different. Notwithstanding that I might disagree with my colleague, Councillor Currick, around looking at it this year, because I think I have an appetite to look at it this year. I do want to reflect that he has some experience about this, and he, I was outside, but I did observe the library discussion and the user fees and charges there, and what that resulted in was, as Mayor Stuart Crosby used to say, was a number of one-term wonders on council. And if you want to make a difference, you've got to be able to be here for more than just 3 or 4 years. And Rick lost a few of his friends, and maybe using the term friend is generous.
Everyone's a friend, mate.
That's right. He's so friendly, but. Yeah, he's been through that and seen the distraction that it creates. Now, I'm up for it, but I just want to add that further context. I'm not your mum, I don't need to speak for you, sorry. But I hope that adds some valuable context to it. He's definitely seen it, and yeah.
And I guess that's part of the process is we'll get that feedback, and if it's really unpopular, then we'll charge them in their rates. That's that's fine. But I guess that's to me the fairness is there's 161,000 people live here, and there's 61,000 people that pay rates. So you've got a smaller number paying for everyone, and I guess this is just an opportunity to shift that, and also charge some of the people from outside our community that don't pay a cent. Which ultimately I think is a fairer system. Councillor Taylor.
Sorry, I was just going to say we can probably multitask and look at both sides of the equation, like looking at cost reductions and how we actually charge those to the community. So I don't think they're exclusive.
I think we need to with the situation we're in. So, Councillor Crowther.
I am interested in sort of staff feedback on it as well, because in the sense that I'm aware staff have said that a long-term plan amendment would be a huge scope of work which wouldn't be feasible without significant delays. I do worry that at the moment I don't feel I've got the information in any kind of context. So what I'd be looking for firstly is what things, without changing any of the user pay structure, without changing any of the rating structure or anything like that, but just looking at what we're doing right now, where can we look at savings, particularly in the capital program, which will flow on to the biggest impacts in the operating expenditure. And I think to me that's, if we are spending a lot of time on user fees and charges and just, you know, desperately trying to get a balanced budget, and I don't know if we're going to get there, but I mean, I love the idea of balanced budgets, but you know, I understand the context for all this, but I keep thinking that the biggest issue will be the net present value calculations of the capital program and what that will mean for the next 40 years or whatever of ratepayers paying back, you know, interest on the debt, depreciation, all that sort of stuff. And we've got some major pieces of infrastructure going into the city and some major pieces of infrastructure that may or may not go into the city, depending on whether we can fit them into this annual plan and the next annual plan and the next long-term plan. And at the moment, I look at what's happened in Wellington, and I think we have to be very thoughtful around how we handle that. And so the priority for me is to look at the big stuff, where there's big money involved, that will have huge implications on the affordability of this city through rates and potentially through user charges, but I think primarily through rates and just the quality of life of the people in this city if we can't afford to do some of those projects. And so I'd like to get really clear on that as the primary goal, then look at other ways to save money in the shorter term, then look at investigating the user pay. I'm happy to do it all if we can do it all, but I'm just aware that we seem to be hearing that there's a limited capacity in the organisation to work through that process. I'd like to really understand what this could look like.
It's probably a good moment. We'll keep moving on because that's part of the conversation that we're going to have as we go. Unless any of the staff have any comments around workload or.
Well, there's certainly workload pressure, and there's also a process issue with some of these things. Is like, you know, what I would say on user fees is that, you know, $3 million of user fee increase would be the equivalent of 1% rates, which is the equivalent of a $30 million roughly of capital change. So it's clear where the big impact on OPEX and therefore rates flows from. It's difficult to get unless you start in things like water charging, which is actually through rates anyway, but it's difficult to get $1 million of movement in saying that every bit of additional revenue adds up. So that's absolutely part of it. And, you know, very much the purpose of today was to actually sort of bring the funnel down to where there's specific user fees that, you know, that still were inside of in the range that we've got. And one thing I wanted to cover before we get into a broader conversation is we do have some activities that have funding challenges that sit there. So that could be one thing that we looked at in the user fees, to look to address those activities only within the user fees, focusing on those other things. But that's what we were, you know, seeking direction out of today, to bring back to a paper that will actually then formally identify what are the things that we're actually going to look at into this annual plan.
Well, looking at the overall activities, and you mentioned the figure for 1% rate saving. Do you think we could even achieve a 1% rate saving through a user fee review?
That's very much a question for council in terms of.
You've been around a while.
Well, it is, but I think, you know, one of the earlier slides showed the trend down in user fees, which indicates the complexity of the conversation with the community that happens in that space. So you would need, you know, outside of those big three of parking, building and airport, you would need to make some very significant changes to get that level of revenue.
Oh, well, parking fees, I wouldn't like to increase those anymore. I think we're up to the maximum. I know there's a desire. Yeah, I know. But, you know, there's a desire there for whatever reasons to ramp them up in terms of deter private motor vehicle use or whatever. But it's come to a point where we need to look at affordability. People don't have options other than hopping in their car, many people. And the wages aren't going up, and it's a big chunk of their wage. You know, I pay for parking in Elizabeth Street building, and a day's parking is $17. You know, even on our 136,000 or whatever we paid, you still feel it. You know, perhaps I'm getting old and miserable and tight, but you know, I think particularly a lot of the younger people who work in the city, that would be a huge impulse. Sure, a lot of them do park quite a way away to get the cheaper parking, but even still, a lot of people are trying to park on the street, you know, further out because they simply can't afford the parking charges. That's one example, and the other ones, what were they? Airport. I think, you know, potentially, that's what I'm saying. This is going to be a hard nut to crack in terms of getting a real benefit and shaving off the transfer from the rates to user fees. And that's why I asked, from your historical knowledge, you've been through the processes of various different politicians around the table, around where we end up. And from my experience, we don't end up with much.
Might be something we use the new engagement system for to get a gauge on people's views. But yeah, I'm just cognizant of time, so we'll keep rolling if that's right.
If I can just jump through 2 slides forward.
That's good.
Here, if that's okay. I just wanted to talk about briefly some of the activities of funding challenges and water and wastewater, and Catherine can probably provide more detail in terms of these are being corrected into the future through some of the price increases there. Water's an interesting activity in the sense that some of it is actually weather dependent in terms of how much revenue we actually collect through the activity. If we have a wet season, people don't water their gardens as much, we get less revenue through there. We also have a program to actually reduce water loss, so the success of that program actually reduces our revenue as well. But there's a flow-on impact, obviously, to infrastructure that sits with that. So that's some of the issues that sit within that. Obviously, with water reform, being spoken about, that will be addressed as part of that conversation there as well. Marine facilities, so marine facilities is wider than just a marine precinct, but it does, the way we're planning for the, on divestment of marine precinct, that all of our marine facilities effectively are not covering those costs at this point in time. So that's something that we need to address over time in terms of a big portion of that is historical funding of things like seawalls that are actually sitting in those activities, that there's probably a good argument can actually have some general rate funding to actually include in there to offset the cost within there. I'm not going to say any more on parking management. I'll leave that for you. Building services has been, obviously impacted by slowdown in terms of consent numbers and so forth. So there's volumetric impact on that, as there is with other regulatory activities. So, that's one option that we can bring back as part of the annual plan. There's some options effectively to actually look to address the funding issues that sit within these particular activities.
I might be missing something, but why wasn't transport listed there?
Because transport is covering its rate funded activity, so the balance of it's funded through general rates.
Through the chair, we're not getting NZTA subsidies for certain projects like the city centre. I would have thought if ever transport's had funding challenges, I would have thought right now we're at the peak transport challenge.
Certainly it has capital funding challenges, but this is very specifically talking about the actual operational cost funding within those activities. So absolutely, and that's part of that. Again, the reforecast paper that we will bring to you on the 29th, which will deal with the issues in terms of the lack of or the loss of revenue that's come through from NZTA, but this is specifically into the operational cost funding.
Oh, I see what you mean. Oh, right, gotcha. Okay, I thought we were jumping. Right, okay.
Want to include road congestion pricing.
No,
that's what I was
personally, no. No new taxes.
could I just jump in there that the slide is a little different from what we sent you in the pack, and we called out, in the pack we said water and wastewater, we haven't put them as challenges, but the reason we put them on the slide like that is they are heavy infrastructure activities with big funding challenges and a large assumption of rates increases into the future, so it's sort of future looking as well. A couple of smaller ones that we didn't call out are cemeteries, which always has a challenge as a 100% user fee funded activity, and Historic Village originally was a 100% user fee funded activity. It moved into kind of rate supporting. Rates now dominates the funding of that activity, but there's a lot of stranded debt from the days when it just couldn't wash its face, so that's the reason we put those ones onto the handout sheet.
So that's the bulk of the slides that we wanted to run through. We haven't put anything on rates in the slides. We have a paper going to accountability, performance and finance on the 5th or 6th of November, effectively looking at the commercial industrial rate options, transport targeted rates, definitions around industrial and so on as part of that, but we could include that conversation today if councillors wanted to.
Just on that. Oh, sorry, is mine on it? No, sorry. Okay, I'll repeat that. So given the noise that we've heard from the community, from the industrial building owners and tenants around the huge level of rates they're facing now with industrial classification introduction, what would the impact be if we just remove that again and just put it all into the commercial bucket? There's quite a big, I'm just trying to recall the percentage of rate requirement that we've allocated to those different ones. I know commercial's got a couple more percent going to be allocated to that sector. What's the industrial portion, and what would the impact be if that was all put into the commercial?
So the portion was industrial 20%, commercial 15%. Jim's nodding. So obviously we'd have to work through the number of commercial ratepayers, what that looks like, which we can bring as part of those future papers in terms of what that would look like.
Even the next meeting that you spoke of, early November, could something like that, just a quick look at.
That's really all the slides that we wanted to actually run through in terms of that, and then in terms of direction to staff, in terms of actually putting future papers as part of the annual plan process, we just wanted to get an understanding from council in terms of, do we want to look at all of the user fees within the bounds of the revenue and financing policy that we have now? We don't have the time to go back to, go through a change of funding needs analysis and revenue financing policy for the annual plan. That could occur after that time frame, but really it was a question of the specific user fees that the council wanted to have a look at within there, or we can bring a list back, or we can leave user fees as they are and other things. It was just direction on that.
Yeah, well, I think we can, while we can go and engage and sort of get a gauge, but that may be part of consultation around the annual plan. I think what's clear is if we're going to do user fees, it's got to be broad, so we don't create that disparity. So, I think we really look through that list and say, if we're going to do this, it's kind of across the board of anything that is reasonable, and the obviously we don't want to get to a situation where it's costing us more to collect the fees than it's worth, but where it's possible and reasonable, then we look at it, and I guess that's our challenge is then to decide on what level is fair and reasonable, for each of those activities.
So what we can do is we can bring to the, and I'm sorry, I don't know the council date of the meeting that the annual plan will come next to, but a list effectively of the ranges of those activities, where those activities are within that range, and potentially the cost implications if there was a change in terms of, and the revenue opportunity that sits there. That would then seek direction to say we want to look at these particular activities. 12th of November.
You wanted, we could have a column that just says complexity of collection, low, medium or high, maybe,
Yeah.
if that...
Well,
if
that's a cost one I was thinking.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay, right,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. So at least we can consider it, and I think we've just got to be aware that we actually charge a lot of user fees already across the community. And Rick's example, we're charging the person playing tennis or the kid playing basketball, but we're not charging in a lot of other situations. So that's really around that parity and that fairness is that everyone that uses our facilities contributes where it's reasonable to collect those. Anyone else have any? Yeah, Councillor Baker.
Morena tātou. Excuse my tardiness this morning. I just, tautoko what you've said, Mahe, and also acknowledge what Rick is saying too, and the only thing I would like to add, in an ideal world, if time pressure wasn't here, I think didn't exist, is that this is a great opportunity for like deliberative democracy type processes and really bringing the community along the journey, because all they see is council taking more money, increasing our rates and all that sort of stuff, and we tend to keep them at a distance. And typically, like even for me, honestly, prior to becoming an elected member, I wasn't aware that we were charged based on land ownership. That's right, eh? Is that right, Paul? Is that what we talked about? Something to that effect? We're rates charged based on land, not really like what we consume and or waste type of thing.
Rates are charged on capital value,
value.
but the land use is part of it, whether it be commercial, industrial or residential.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I was trying to say now. But to the point, I think this is this could be an example of a way that we can exercise some authentic engagement, to your point. And it'll be a great way as we do this journey together with our community to ease tensions and bring understanding and enlightenment with our community rather than just to our community, which is what council tends to do. So just a whakaaro.
What the scope of the user fee review was during the LTP process last year or early this year?
So that was a broad exercise starting from that funding needs analysis through to revenue and financing policy through to user fee proposals. So it was across the board.
So that's what I'm hearing from this governance group, is something similar to that? And if so,
For clarity though, what we would do is not go back as across the board. We would look at effectively within the ranges that exist within the revenue and financing policy. So, for example, if council wanted to, I keep thinking of boat ramp fees, sorry. It's the easiest example I can think of, but if they wanted to look at the marine facilities funding effectively, and that is in the 0 to 30% range, they could say we want to consult on a 20% of that. But in light of how does that compare with tennis fees or whatever like that within those ranges as well. But it's not as comprehensive as what was done there, because we're not going back to the basis of that funding needs analysis. It's really confirming what I'm hearing is a desire for a conversation considering the various equity between all of the functions we do together, not one at a time.
I think the key thing to all of this is, and if we engage early, I think that's a positive, but it's actually when those user fees were put up, there wasn't a good communication policy. There wasn't an explanation, and everyone got to the point that people have mentioned that people just felt like they were paying twice for the thing. And so I think it's very important that we explain that, you know, this is apportioning the cost to different groups rather than, and so it will reduce your rates, you know, and that we can consult on that and say, we'll give you a 12% increase in your rates, or if you accept user fees, we'll give you 11%, whatever that is, you know, and that's really the key difference is that this is not an extra revenue or increased revenue for us. It's just apportioning who pays that the costs, and it's coming back to we're not getting any more revenue. It's just where it's coming from is changed. So, you know, that's and I can see it's an absolute challenge. But look, at the end of the day, we've you know said to the community, we're going to be accountable, we're going to be transparent, and if they want to engage and say we're happy to pay extra rates and not use user fees, well, we'll listen to the community and we'll do that. But you know, what I keep hearing is people saying our rates are unaffordable, I don't want as bigger increases, and this is an opportunity for them to not have those increases. And if they're against that and they're happy with the way it is, then that's fine as well.
It needs to be in the context of achievement of that goal. And as mentioned, you know, potentially the end result of a user fee review that could end up with a lot of noise from the community. And I imagine even a recreational reader via a library book charge, you know, that's a big section of the community that will have been highly resistant, versus that's what Councillor Crowther mentioned, that we have bigger fish to fry in terms of trying to readjust the budgets in the long term. And that's why I just reiterate that the distraction, that this potentially may cause where we have got those bigger fish to fry. And really, I think we need to focus there. Just my reiteration.
Well, no, that's I understand that, and I think we're going to be trying to do everything at once, and I believe it's achievable. But at the end of the day, if that's the view of elected members, I'm happy to rate our people, but I just keep hearing from people they want to reduce their rates, and this is a way to reduce their rates. And if we want to reduce rates, we've got to look at other ways of doing it, because this is the way we've done it all the time, and the rates just keep going up. So that's very much I just think it's a no-brainer. And as I say, if we engage with our community and they tell us that they want their rates increased more, and they because they're not people aren't paying for the services, then we'll keep increasing the rates. Councillor Crowther.
Yeah, I doubt people will be suggesting that. I guess I'm a bit concerned that we're sort of like, one analogy would be, we've got a fire, we need to put out the fire. We're exploring options for getting an alternative water supply. When we've kind of got a water supply there, we just need to put out the fire. And the CapEx for some big projects is, to me, the quickest and most efficient and most logical way to make some savings. And we basically have to do that anyway. And I'm really concerned that we're going to spend so much time doing a comprehensive user fees and charges review, and we might get the 1%, but the reason I'm not confident we'll get the 1% reduction in rates, which I'd be very happy to take and very happy to undertake that, so I'm not against what the Mayor's saying at all, but my concern is that we have to factor in that the parking fees, which are a significant portion of that conversation, have to increase significantly to fund Te Manamataki o Te Papa, and so we have to increase those anyway. Sorry, Rick. If we are to follow the funding plan for Te Manamataki, otherwise we have to find some other ways of funding Te Manamataki. And so that's one thing. In terms of the airport, I don't know what excuse me, what the possibilities are there. I'd be open to that. I know my mates at Tourism Bay of Plenty would be interested in the conversation, but I don't know how much scope we've got to get it. But when I look at that graph that was put up there, I'm just concerned we're going to get less than 1% reduction. and when I look at what's the conversations around the country, we need to get from, is it 13% forecast rates increase this year, roughly? We need to get down into single figures. So if we spend all our time doing the user fees and charges conversation, I'm just concerned we're going to miss some real-time opportunities around this, and that includes the Civic Whare Exhibition Centre Museum, which has, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars of operating expenditure flowing from it, and there are many people in this community who want that scale back, and they are supporters of the arts and culture and avid supporters of a museum, but they want that scale back, not scrapped. They want it scaled back to an affordable project, and we're spending all this time talking about things that to me are just a bit of a side issue to the fact that we've got a house on fire and we need to put the fire out.
If I could just make a comment, I think, you know, what we'll bring to you in that November meeting will actually, we're only talking about the user fee component today effectively as part of it, but there's obviously a broader annual plan conversation to take place, which will include the capital program, it'll include the operational expenditure, it'll include the balanced budget, and all of that information will come back as part of that. At that point, we will include things like, you know, how hard is it to increase airport fees and what value would you get out of it? That is a council decision then, and say, right, well, we don't want to touch all of these things, and we want to focus on capital, or we want to do something different. That will come to you as a, because that needs to be a formal decision by council to actually take that forward into the annual plan.
Yeah, and I think just a reminder, we're only having this conversation because actually it was something that was raised at a previous meeting and asked for by council. If you don't want to look at user fees as part of the next annual plan, just give us that message and we'll hunt elsewhere.
I'll just go back to something that Councillor Currick brought up at a few meetings ago about the library, and that's probably what got us into this discussion, that he thought there was parts of the community that weren't paying for the services they were getting. I think we need to do the work on this and set it for the future. Like, it's a good conversation to have, and I understand what you're saying, Glenn, about the big stuff, and we will be looking at the big stuff too, but we should be looking under every piece of rock we can find to get the savings we need to get.
While you're busy looking under rocks, there's a landslide happening above you.
If I could just make one comment on that, I think, you know, to put it in context, is that a comprehensive review of user fees will take longer than what we can do within the annual plan, and that could be the direction that's given effectively, is to focus on other things for this annual plan and not touch the user fees. It's the option.
So another option would be to try and identify half a dozen areas where we think there is the opportunity to increase revenue through user fees, and there are some obvious ones. And then the other healthy exercise, I think, would be to go through a process of just understanding the apportionment of community good and user fees, and that's a reasonably simple exercise. It's really just a conversation and agreement around, is the percentage about right or not? And you know, philosophically through that process you land on a spot. That process won't necessarily create more revenue through that apportionment, but it'll at least give you a level of comfort that actually the right apportionment is being paid by the user and the right apportionment is being paid by the general community. So it's and that's not it's not an exhaustive exercise. It's probably a good thing to do.
Yeah, just on the whole user fees thing, when we do the messaging around user fees, you need to be very clear what the fee's actually doing. In my view, it's not a capital fee, it is an OPEX fee. So the people who are using that, whether it's a sports field, a gymnasium, any sporting event, tennis court, they're paying for what the council has to pay to upkeep that facility at its current state going forward. It's not to repay any capital expenditure, that's already been provided for in the general rates. So the fee, when the public see the fee, it is a fee to cover the cost of what we, the council, have to pay in order to keep it up to its current state so the public can continue to use it, and that fee I think is better to be paid by the person that predominantly uses that facility.
And just for clarification, would that include like interest and depreciation?
We'll have a look at both.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
for clarity, our current fee structure will include, like parking, for example, pays for depreciation and interest on parking.
It's got to be something that and it's easily explained what the fee's actually doing. Just saying it's a user fee, or what everyone says, what's it actually paying for? So if we're very clear in the messaging about what the public's getting for it and why my fee for my sports event or my community event is higher than someone else's, it's because your service just costs more to operate. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, I think we just have to be careful because of that community benefit that we're not saying that user fees are actually going to cover the full cost. In most cases, it's a contribution. It's a contribution, and whether it might just be that's what we've got to explore. Whether it's kind of ad hoc that we sort of decide where the balance between that community benefit and affordability sits, or whether we say okay, sports courts are more expensive than fields, so therefore we charge the sports courts more. That's a philosophical conversation that we've got to have, but my sort of feeling on it is it's more it's a contribution, and it's balancing that public good to people contributing, and so it might be that you're not actually covering the costs, you're just having a contribution. Yep.
I think the affordability lens needs to be fairly close to our discussion, because the last thing we want to achieve, I'm sure, is a decrease in the participation of particularly children into sport and other recreation, because that's certainly, when we look at the health and well-being of our community, that's really important, because that's our future generations. And that also applies to adults in terms of their health and well-being. So both the impact of that activity on health and well-being and also affordability, it's got to be right up there in terms of the criteria.
Just following up on something that the Mayor mentioned earlier was people from outside our city using our facilities. Do we have any handle on what potentially we might be missing out on in that area?
Yeah, Christine might be able to add to this in terms of, there's some history in terms of, I'm not sure what information we can get. So I think areas like Lyrie can track some of that information quite well. There has been historical agreements with Western Bay in terms of where they've paid a broader contribution in for those services. So there's a lot of different ways we can approach that conversation.
Just on that point, we are the major centre for a sub-region. Although we have these geographical boundaries that mean that the users of many of our facilities, many of the facilities that we're building today and all of our infrastructure is used by a wider population. There's been work done on what that looks like. There's a one-pager. The question is whether you want to open that conversation up or not, because it's reasonably contentious. Because our neighbours who use this city as their major centre haven't necessarily paid for the services that are provided, and I think wouldn't want to. Clearly, there is a one-pager. It's factual information. We can put it up if you want.
Yeah. I was interested, because is it still right that at Mount Hot Pools you pay less as a resident? So how is that sort of administered, I guess, to prove that you're
As a user, you take a invoice or something like that shows your residential address, and they will give you a little card.
Parking tickets are good ones.
So we actually have a card. Because that potentially is something that could be useful. But some services, if you're a resident, is a reduction. I just don't know. Could we roll that out widely, or is that
we could have a look into that. So, and you know, for example, the pools use if you've got a tech card, what is now, or something that used to be the tech card, but well, I'm not sure how they do it now. But there's
I guess I probably wasn't thinking about the small margin between a resident's charge and what we might charge someone from outside. I was thinking of things that we give to our residents for free that the outside people are getting gratis, and that's probably where the big opportunity to get some more revenue comes from, perhaps.
Yeah, let's look at it.
There is a bit of history here too, because actually, Christine and Paul, you'll know that wasn't there an annual sum or fee that Western Bay District Council used to pay us for the benefit of their residents using our facilities, and then there was a change a number of years ago as a result of, I think, another investment. What are the details behind that?
So that's it. Yeah. I think probably what I would reiterate is it is a somewhat contentious discussion around the two districts and how the two areas and how they work together. But what used to happen way back, and it's a bit of a beast, but just make it bigger. Just make it bigger, and we're starting in that the top box that's called formal cost sharing agreement. Just keep going bigger and bigger so we can see that. So there used to be a cost sharing agreement between Tauranga City Council and Western Bay where there was an annual charge, and that was stopped in 2003. So at that time the annual charge was 269,000, and it was made up of a couple of components, and it was to recognise the use of TCC facilities that were used by Western Bay Penty residents. So it was their contribution share. And you can see what it was made up at the time. It wasn't based on any assessment at that time of actual usage, and there was a bit of that was when there was no economic development agency, and so they wanted to get a shared economic development agency, which was priority 1, up and going at the time. And the agreement was that if Western Bay contributed to an economic development agency, then it would stop making these contributions. And the council of the day decided that they wanted to get the Economic Development Agency up and going, and so they proceeded with this. Then if you go down to the next box down, that's Western Bay Volunteer. So if you're happy, I'll just move through each of these boxes and give you a bit of an explanation. So that one there, so we used to have a City Partners program, that's been reconstituted now, and they used to make a payment, they made a payment to that. There was some outstanding old disputes, so there was like a wash-up, clean-up payment where both councils put on the table all of the financial gripes that they had between the two, and there was a settlement, and it was cleared the decks, and let's move forward. That no council would raise historic issues. So this was a couple of the historic issues. Then you go down to the next box, economic development, just move it across so we can see it. So this was the introduction of the economic development arrangement. So there was this joint, we have a targeted rate on our commercial sector, Western Bay, at that time funded by General. I think that might still be the same. And that was, as I said, a quid pro quo. We had a per capita funding arrangement, so number of people. Over time, what happened is we continued to increase ours and they decreased theirs. So if you keep going down, and they started up their own economic development agencies, like they've got Catch Caddy and a few others. So you can see that the shares in 2016 we were 81% and they were 19. Over time it increased, we were 87. So with the shift happened, that TCC continued to increase our contribution, and Western Bay didn't do it to the same extent. So, and we could update those numbers for now. So this, as I say, this was a piece of work done a few years ago. So then if we can go back up to the top and go one box in, which would take us to the library. Yep, this one here. So there are reciprocal access rights for residents. there was a sub-regional DC. So what happened was the Western Bay used to collect development contributions from its community to recognise the fact that our facilities provided access for Western Bay ratepayers, and they used to hand over that development contribution to us. That's all stopped. Western Bay people do use our library, so and you'll see here. So this is including lockdown over COVID, but 12% of our total members are from the Western Bay, and 9% of our total annual issues are also from the Western Bay. And we have a small number of our people who use Western Bay libraries. So if you look at the annual costs, if there was a proportionate share, I mean that's quite a significant annual contribution that you'd be getting for Western Bay. So that's just factual information. Then we'll move across to the further to the right. So there are a couple of parks that are TCC owned, funded and operated, which are in the Western Bay District and provide some sub-regional benefits, but there is no financial contribution from Western Bay at this time, so that's summarised there using 2022 and 23 numbers. Then if you go down to the next box, indoor and recreation. So we both provide some space for our community. When the hockey field was expanded, there were some contributions from others, but not from Western Bay. And similarly, there was no contributions to things like athletics. So those facilities, there's no hockey facilities elsewhere in the sub-region. They're all in the Tauranga district and funded by us. And similarly, there's no athletic track in the sub-region. There's one and it's funded by us. Keep going. There are joint parks, so we've got Tekta and Huharua, and these two parks are owned 50-50 and OPEX is shared 50-50. They have a lead, so the Western Bay is lead on both of those, and we agree annual budgets and fund. And you can see at the bottom some data about how many people are using the facilities. Go back into the middle, go back to the airport there. So that's another interesting one. The Crown withdrew from the airport, and TCC and Western Bay were in there together with the Crown as joint owners. We asked them to step aside because there's a whole series of tax issues. They agreed that they would hold their interest, but there's no return. So none of the revenue from the airport goes to Western Bay. There is, we agreed to buy at the Crown, and we did pay Western Bay for the interests, but they still own some interest in the title. So that was the arrangement. If you wanted to change any of those land ownership interests or how the airport operates, there's agreement with the Crown and Western Bay that we'd have to work through and agree. And just, is that covered it? Just go back. I think that's covered it all, probably. And then just over the far left, sorry, I keep going far left, keep going, there's some stuff in the orange. Just perhaps work from the top of that. So there are some other joint initiatives here, just to show you some of the other things that we do together with some, they're much smaller, but it just gives you an idea of some of the other things. So that was sort of like trying to encapsulate in one place the actual facts about the services that are provided that have a sub-regional use and what the contributions are from each of the councils.
Yeah, and just perhaps just to finish off, the most recent piece of work we've done on this is as part of going through the infrastructure funding and financing process for Te Manawataki o Te Papa, we needed to do a beneficiary analysis to understand who the users would be and arguably how those costs could be apportioned across the users. And Paul, are you able to provide the detail on that?
Yeah, just off memory, it was, so we were required, there was 10% of external beneficiary effectively outside the boundary, so which is why one of the requirements, if IFF had proceeded, is some of that external money, there had to be at least 10% of that external money coming outside the boundary, like say through government grant or something like that.
In terms of operational, though, was there a target there? Is it your 10% would be capital, but
well, the beneficiary analysis is consistent over both, but that that could have been a future decision in terms of this conversation again. But for the IFF transaction, that's only looking at capital.
This opens up a whole new discussion, though, really, this. And like I say, after decades of potentially trying, I'm not quite sure whether we really want to open it up. But.
almost sorry I asked the question, and very, very impressed with the result, Christine. That was pretty quick.
Yeah, I'll be very happy for the conversation. I guess I'm just wanting to contextualise these figures though, because I'm looking at something like the library, and I see the numbers, and I'm thinking it doesn't stack up with our total OPEX implications for, say, when it said the projected 2031 numbers. So is this quite a dated? Yeah. Right. Okay. It'd be real. I mean, I don't know how much work it is to update it, but I mean, to me, this is where, in terms of bang for buck, I don't know how it sits, but I mean, I don't think we should be at all afraid of a discussion. Having talked to a number of those councillors, you know, I mean, I know what they think, and I think that we just have to have fairness across the sub-region, and you know, this may not be an instant solution to it, but I don't think there's any reason not to have the conversation. It seems a good time to have it. We are in a funding crisis, and if you don't have it then, I don't know when we're going to have it. We're looking at our waters infrastructure. We're looking at a whole lot of collaborative conversations with that council. I think we need to, you know, factor that in.
Councillor Morris.
Yeah, briefly to inform that discussion, it'd be good to see what other city councils and their hinterland district partners around the country, what sort of arrangements they have with each other. It may help or hinder our cause with our neighbours.
Hamilton are just charging more to outsiders to visit their gardens. So I know Alistair, he can send you the link if you like. He's just sent it to me. It'd be interesting to see what happens to patronage.
$20 for a visit or $39 for a year is the external charge.
I'm not sure whether that applies to Cambridge residents or not, but
Right, is there any other discussions?
we're happy to bury this again. So.
Yeah, Councillor Morris.
No, I'm happy to again, if we're looking under each stone or pebble as the landslide comes down, I think this has got to be part of it. And it would be useful to know what others, it'd be useful to know what other districts and cities, what relationships they have with each other. It may help or hinder the case with Western Bay.
It might be that we put in a user fee, and if we decide against user fees, then our residents and people can have the service for free, but the outsiders pay. Councillor Baker.
Hi, sorry, not a fully formed thought yet, and perhaps you guys can help frame my question, but do we look at currently how much we lose as a city with the amount of waste, like not just rubbish waste, but I guess broadly what we waste and how much we could save if we targeted, because I hear if we had initiatives or actions to reduce waste, and broadly speaking, and the thought only comes to mind because I hear a lot of, and rightly so, you know, we're trying to ease pressure for our communities, but the only mechanism I'm hearing is through charging somewhere, somehow, in some way. But perhaps there's some more practical things we can do to reduce our waste and excess as an individual or as an organisation, obviously, but not a fully formed. But do you understand? Do you catch my drift? Is what I'm kind of.
There's probably a couple of bits to it. There's a specific waste, as in waste, or there's a efficiency conversation, and part of what we'll bring back into that future annual plan meetings is a piece of work to be done around organisational efficiency, and coming to the question about cost structure. A big chunk of operational cost structure comes from what our capital program is, but we've obviously also got a big organisation in terms of operations, and that will be part of balanced budget, right-sized organisation and operational efficiency initiatives as part of that to come back to you. Is that?
I think so. Yeah, just thinking out loud. So yeah.
Right. Thank you. Have we got any other questions? Yeah.
I was going to ask it earlier. Around the last year's user fee and charges review, libraries were specifically excluded or not specifically? Was there a discussion to include or not? Because that was a glaring omission, was discussion around or consultation about recreational reading, apart from the hot titles.
The library that we have here follows the library trends as far as what we charge for. So we didn't consider at that time charging for the rental of library books like you used to pay the $1 or the $2 to rent out your normal books. The fees and charges were focused on things like renting rooms in the facility or the hot topics, as you say. So yeah, I guess you could say it was excluded.
Just on that, I'd be interested, Barbara, to get your opinion as to, you know, like if we were to look at libraries, you know, like what would be the best system? Is it, you know, $20 a year to join, or is it a per title, you know, kind of charge?
It's actually in the Local Government Act that if we have got a library, we can't charge you a joining fee. So why that might be the simplest way to actually collect some revenue. It's excluded through the Local Government Act. So what we do though is charge for cards and things, you know, things like that. So it's a little bit cunning probably. But the only way you can charge is for the service you provide, and that would be leasing of books, a higher fee for you know, the special topics, and obviously there's a differential opportunity if you go down that way for external. We do charge for events that you run, and you know, the other thing would be school holiday programs. It gets really messy, and I guess it depends on what you want a library to do. And a library fundamentally, I guess, is accepted as an opportunity to educate, train our children in particular. So I think this is one thing you have to have. My suggestion would be a really good conversation around your revenue and funding policy, because I believe that most people who support and go to a library use that opportunity to educate their children. So you know, it just depends where you sit on it, I guess.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it is a national trend, basically, not to charge for library services. We've seen over the last decade things like penalties and all that sort of thing just drop, because not only did it detract from people using the service, the number of transactions, it was ridiculous. 5-cent penalties, and I mean, we don't need to go back too far when there were regimes in there that were punitive, and the whole trend has basically moved towards these being open facilities where people can come and essentially learn. Yeah. So.
But that's where my focus is it's not on learning, because there is real value to that public benefit, but it's around recreational, and people choose tennis for their recreational, for their well-being, versus other activities. But when we come to recreational reading, which that person chooses for their recreational and well-being, that's where I struggle with in terms of disparity, and those were the arguments where the people that use the boat ramps and saying, well, you know, the library service currently, where is it here, 16 and a half, well, nearly 17 million it costs to provide that service for libraries and community hubs. It collects 1% of that nearly 17 million in user fees. That's where people struggle. And that's what I'm saying. If we enter this debate and exclude a recreational reading, when there are other options for people, and I think there would be a willingness to pay, But if we exclude that, then we can't then talk to all the other users on that basis, because the disparity is so clear, and that's what I'm saying. This is going to be a tough cookie, and if we're not going to talk seriously about recreational reading, you know, there's the hot titles, and you know, we're getting revenue from that. But there's a huge cost of service in providing recreational reading, the fiction stuff, you know. So that's, I'm just saying to my members here, hey, you know, people will focus on this if we specifically exclude it. So it's difficult.
Ultimately, these come down to council decisions. So, and we can do whatever you want, but it's really a debate whether or not you're supported by your colleagues or not. I mean, that's the conversation, because we can go down and explore that.
Is there any more questions on user fees? Because I guess I think the direction is that bring them back. Let's have a look at them, and you know, we can make some decisions. Obviously, can't make any decisions today. And is there anything else you want to cover? Then, in the light of efficiency and productivity, we'll get back and everyone can get back to their duties. So I'll just ask, we'll go back to Councillor Baker. Can we just have a karakia to close?
Ka pai, tēnā tātou. Mihi ana kia koe, Steve, nau I whakatūwhiri tō tātou hui I te rā nei. Mihi ana kia koe. Kia tāre watunga ki te kōrero, ki te rangi koe a tēnei te whakawātea ki nei tūturu whakamaua kia tīna haumie, hui e, tai ki e.
Thank you, everyone, and declare the workshop closed at 10:42.